My dear Divyavani viewers, welcome once again to this program. We are trying to deepen our understanding of the Bible, especially during this Easter season. Last week, I gave some details about how the church began to grow, how St. Paul with the Barnabas and then later with Timothy and so on, preached the gospel and spread the church. If we look at the history of this whole movement, it's something so surprising. Last week I mentioned St. Paul seems to have started maybe in 39 or 40 AD, which means hardly 7 years, 8 years after Jesus' death. And by that time, Christianity already spread, not by the preaching of any individual missionary, but from word of mouth, from people to people. And it spread to practically the whole area. Wherever Paul went, he met Christians. Maybe they did not know much, but they heard about Jesus, they believed Jesus, and in that way they had become disciples of Jesus. Paul continued that movement, and last week I gave you the details about the first missionary journey of Paul. And if we look at that journey, how from place to place Paul traveled. He had Barnabas with him, sometimes by land, sometimes by sea, but he traveled so much. There were oppositions. Sometimes he was persecuted, but he was not discouraged. When he was persecuted in one place, he moved to another place. And in that way, Paul traveled, especially all of Greece, and then later, today I will mention, he will reach Athens, and from there he will proceed to Corinth and so on. So, traveling from place to place, preaching the gospel, converting people, baptizing them, encouraging them, especially when there was persecution, encouraging them, strengthening especially in the faith. Today I continue with the same missionary journey of Paul. All these are mainly in the book of Acts, chapter 13, and today especially I will be with chapter 14. What you must keep in mind is the way the church grew. There were difficulties and problems, but then they also found ways of solving those problems. If we take Acts chapter 14, from the first verse onwards, there was problem for Paul and Barnabas, but then courageously they preached. They also worked miracles, and in one case a crippled man was healed, and the people thought that these are gods. So much so that they named Barnabas Zeus, one of the important gods of the Greek pantheon, and Paul was called Hermes, and people brought animals to sacrifice to these gods who appeared among them as men. And Paul told them, "We are just men like you. Do not make any sacrifice. It's wrong. Don't do it." And so on. Even with all these words, people were not fully satisfied. Apparently, they still tried to offer sacrifices to them. What is important to note is, despite the difficulties and persecutions and oppositions, Paul and Barnabas both were successful in the missionary work. If we proceed to chapter 15 of Acts, we come across a big problem, the problem of circumcision. From Judea, believers came, especially Pharisees came and said, unless you are circumcised, you will not be saved. This was a problem because God saved, or God promised to save the children of Abraham, not others. And in that Old Testament, all the emphasis was that first they have to be children of Abraham. To become the children of Abraham, circumcision was necessary. So only with circumcision they are entitled to salvation. But then what about the pagans, the non-Jews, the Greeks, who believed Jesus and wanted to follow Jesus? Many Jewish converts argued for circumcision. Paul and Barnabas had long arguments with them. They were not convinced. Paul could not convince these people that circumcision is not necessary. Paul said, all are saved, all receive the gift of salvation, not by circumcision, not by anything else, but by the grace that Jesus brings to us. It is only through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ that we are saved. Still, people were not convinced. So, finally, Paul referred the matter to Jerusalem, to the apostles and to the elders, and wanted a decision taken by the church in Jerusalem. They gathered. They met to discuss this whole problem of circumcision. And they had very heated arguments. Finally, Peter got up and said, we are saved by the grace of Jesus Christ, not by circumcision. And therefore, it is not right that we impose circumcision on others. What we need is Jesus' grace. A few things must be observed. That was okay, because one problem was the meat offered as sacrifice. The reason for this rule was this: there were plenty of animals being sacrificed every day. If you go to Calcutta, the Kali temple, you will see from morning till evening, goats and sheep are just sacrificed there. And those who offer the sacrifice may not be able to eat all that. So what they do, they sell it to the butchers. In Greece, this was happening. The butchers, the meat sellers, they buy this meat offered as sacrifice, and that is available in the market. And sometimes you would not know whether it is a genuine one or whether it is a sacrificial one. But the believers were told not to purchase, buy that meat, because that is offered to some god as a sacrifice. So a few rules they imposed on the believers, but regarding circumcision, very clearly they said that should not be imposed on anyone. And that was something that the Greeks and the pagans welcomed. In order to make sure that this decision is implemented, from Jerusalem they sent a representative with the letter of the apostles, so that that letter will be read in the churches, so that the churches, the believers, will know that this is a decision taken by the authorities, the church in Jerusalem. And in that meeting, Peter and afterwards James, both of them will speak against the circumcision, and that was followed all through. This was a historical decision. Because that decision was implemented, we are free of this obligation. The church implemented it already at that time. We'll pause for a while. We'll continue after a few minutes.